we're a big employer in this country. 2.4 million Canadians work in charities and nonprofits, about 10% of the Canadian labor force. And so it's important that when government is making policy decisions, that it's doing so in an informed way, because it's affecting people in every community in this country.
Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, MP Garnet Jennis. There are a lot of things going on in our country right now, a lot of different kinds of challenges, and they seem to change from week to week. But the one thing that is consistent is that we need a strong charitable sector to be there, supporting those who are affected by various trends, those who are struggling, those who need assistance in our country. So I'm very pleased that we're able to have a conversation today specifically about the charitable sector in Canada, what it does, also the legal operating environment, and some of the ways that policies from the federal government can impact the operating environment for charitable organizations. So for this conversation, I'm very pleased to be joined by Bruce MacDonald, who's the president and CEO of Imagine Canada, and Deina Warren, who's the director of legal affairs at the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. So Bruce and Deina, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for being invited.
And just by way of sort of continuing the introduction, I thought it would be better to ask you to introduce your organizations rather than have me try to summarize it. So, Bruce, why don't you kick us off? Just to kind of introduce and frame the discussion. What is Imagine Canada? What kind of work do you do there?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to join you here on your podcast. So, Imagine Canada, we're a national registered charity, and really what we seek to do is improve the operating environment in which social good takes place. For us, social good is defined as registered charities, nonprofits, because those are different, social entrepreneurs, and as well, our work takes us into contact with the federal government, with the news media, and with corporate Canada. And so ideally, our work, which centers around public policy advocacy at a federal level, the delivery and development of lots of research and data about the sector, accrediting organizations for the highest levels of good governance, transparency, and accountability, and bringing together a plurality of voices to talk about how Canadians can understand and value the impact of organizations in the community level. When we do all that together, ideally, it's better for organizations on the ground to raise more money, find more volunteers, deliver more quality programs. That's what we seek to do.
Okay, perfect. And before I go to Deina, just to probe one aspect of what you said that may not be familiar to everyone, you made the distinction at the beginning between charities, not-for-profits, social organizations that may not be defined and organizationally in that way, but are still trying to do good. Just if you could give people a quick Coles notes on kind of the distinctions and why we're going to focus mainly on charities today. So what distinct advantages do charities have in law, and what's important about that?
Yeah, so essentially, registered charities and nonprofits are constructs of the Income Tax Act. And probably the easiest way to understand it is that a nonprofit organization has one tax benefit. They don't pay income tax. A registered charity has two tax benefits. Just like the nonprofit, they don't pay tax, but as well, they have the privilege of writing receipts that Canadians can use, the charitable donation tax receipts that they can use on their income tax every year. Now, one of the big things for folks to understand is that there's also a lot more sort of regulation. There is a lot more reporting that goes along with registered charitable status than nonprofit status. And so it is a very accountable and highly governed part of our sector.
Mm-hmm. So more benefits and also more administrative compliance requirements associated with those benefits. Deina, the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities, tell us a bit about what work you do.
Sure, happy to. And likewise, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Lovely to share the screen with Bruce as well. So the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities, also known as the 4Cs, because it is a lot easier to say. So we are also a national registered charity. We have been in existence since the early 70s. And our aim is to support Christian Charities to be exemplary, healthy, and effective organizations. So, what does that exactly mean? Well, we provide education, a lot of resources. We actually have people, human beings, who answer the phone to provide information and resources to charities working on the ground, and services that can strengthen their organizational operation so as to maximize their good work. Basically, we want to help behind the scenes for the most part so that they can shine. Like, imagine we have an accreditation program to bring additional accountability and transparency into organizations that choose to do so, and platforms to create interconnectedness between members, creating those relationships within the sector. And then another important piece of our work that I get particularly excited about does relate to some of our legal and policy advocacy. So we engage on matters that are of importance to the whole sector, of course, and to faith-based organizations particularly, but always with a view to the sector as a whole, so that they can continue to operate in favorable legal and regulatory environments, recognizing the importance of charities within our social fabric and wanting to ensure a secure future for them.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you both for being here, but more importantly for the work you're doing, supporting the charitable sector. Um, Deina, I'll go to you first for this next question. We talk a lot in Parliament about kind of the increasing demands on charities, increasing use of food banks in our country, for instance, is just kind of one marker of challenges people are facing. Maybe start with you and then go to Bruce afterwards. If you can share a bit about just what you're seeing in terms of demand for charitable supports and how the organizations you work with are trying to respond to this demand.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's lots of information out there, but as recent as just March of last year, there would have been over 2 million visits to food banks, which was the highest number in history. So that's like a 6% year over year increase and a 90% increase compared to 2019. I believe that's from Food Banks Canada. And so that's certainly one. And we have seen a lot of our constituency, a lot of our members, as places of worship, for example, pivoting to expand or include food bank services or other social services. And certainly that has been, we have absolutely seen an explosion in that. We tend to hear more of the questions about how to operate that than the demand per se, but we
Right.
absolutely have been seeing that. Yeah.
But I guess, in terms of the operational questions, you're getting people that are trying to do this administrative work of expanding, maybe starting new charities to meet that need, and need your expertise to sort of figure out how to do that. Is that sort of the
Yeah,
context?
often looking, how can we incorporate this as part of our mission?
Right.
Part of our mission is to support and serve our community, to share why we want to do this, to love our neighbors in this really tangible way. And so, yes, we get some of those questions, and often it's a very simple question. Certainly, it's a means of outreach, and many churches I know and other places of worship do this on a regular basis.
hmm Bruce, what are you seeing in terms of the demand for charitable services in our country?
Yeah, well, just building off what Deina said, I mean, it's interesting that the charitable and nonprofit sector has this sort of paradoxical relationship with the economy in a way. And so, when you think about it, when businesses are under pressure, when families are under distress, two things happen. One is, on one hand, demand for services for charities and nonprofits, the ones that they deliver in communities, goes up, and on the other hand, as businesses may be struggling or families have less to work with, the ability to fund those services also comes under pressure. And what we've seen essentially since the start of the pandemic is an almost unabated increase in demand for services. And certainly in the COVID days, the hard COVID days, that was very much there. We did expect to see that sort of taper off a little bit. Then we hit that period of what I would call stubborn inflation. And that also affected families and businesses and communities. So demand for services remained high. We've now also seen this period where, core costs for families have remained difficult.
Yeah.
Whether it is food, whether it's cost of affordable housing, whatever it might be. So it's continued to keep pressure. And so what we've seen right across our sector is organizations reporting. So whether it is housing and homelessness, affordability issues, mental health distress, I would even say, organizations that we've seen are working on climate change are saying things are challenging. And so at the same time as the sector is trying to respond to the needs in their communities, any economic pressures at a macro level kind of inhibit the ability of organizations to meet that stubbornly high demand.
Yeah. So what do folks do in those kinds of situations? I mean, I guess you kind of muddle through doing your best, but the circumstances are getting harder, I guess, is the bottom line.
Yeah, we're definitely muddlers.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the great part about, on one hand, I've heard this expression. On one hand, a great strength of our sector is its resilience, and on another hand, a great weakness is its resilience, meaning that we will continually try and do more with less. And at times, I think we need to take a firmer line and say, high quality services can't be delivered without the dollars necessary to do those, be those government dollars from foundations, from corporations, or for individuals. We actually need to do that. The other thing that I would throw in has been the disruption to the volunteer side of the equation, again, starting with the pandemic, where, for a variety of reasons, including lockdowns and closures, they couldn't be there to deliver services. And we've seen a rise in volunteerism and civic participation since then, but not really back to pre-pandemic levels. And the other part that then implicated was staff, who then were required to jump in and do work that had been primarily done by volunteers. And so it has created, in this sector, nonprofits and charities employ 10% of the Canadian workforce, some burnout issues, some exhaustion issues. So it is a sector that continues to muddle through and do the good work, but it's one where we actually do need to pay attention to the people and the infrastructure to make sure it's there for the long term.
Yeah, and Deina, are you seeing the same dynamics or different dynamics in terms of volunteer participation in Christian and other faith-based charities? Is it similar? Is it different?
Well, it's actually interesting to note sort of the urge to volunteerism. It is quite robust within a faith-based sector, and what you do tend to find is there is a larger proportion of those who would adhere to, who would say they're actively religious, which generally is at least engagement on a weekly basis, who are actively religious. You do tend to see higher proportions of volunteerism. Now, that's not to say they don't need more volunteers. I think there's, a saying that 10 or 20% of the people tend to do 80% of the work. But there is that small piece of encouragement within the faith-based charities that there is volunteerism, and that doesn't apply to just faith-based charities, I should say. It's that active religious engagement encourages volunteerism in religious and non-religious charitable work. So we see that as a positive thing and a point of encouragement.
Okay. I wanted to ask about, kind of at a sort of philosophical level, the role of charities in society. I think most people I talk to would affirm the important role played by charities, but I meet people from time to time who say the government really should be doing that, right? They look at things that maybe are being done by charities or have historically been done by charities, and they say, well, we should actually just have the government roll in to do that. If you can compare the benefits of private charities doing certain social functions versus governments coming in and saying we're gonna tax and use tax dollars to provide this as a state social service instead of by a private charity. What are the kind of pros and cons to the different models from your perspective? Bruce, do you want to start off on this one?
Sure, happy to. So first of all, I don't think it's an either or conversation. I think it's a yes and. I think there's a place for both in the system that supports communities. I'd also take maybe a further step back. I'm a believer that there's not a solution, there's a multitude of solutions. And so in reality, we're thinking of a whole of community approach. Government has its place in terms of fully funding services, creating an enabling regulatory and legislative framework, charities and nonprofits as strong and stable operators there for the long term, a tax system that inspires philanthropy in a variety of ways, and also ensuring that the business community is engaging as strong supporters and that individuals are playing their role too. So I think it's important to note that the charitable and nonprofit sector, we are effective and efficient operators delivering quality programs in a cost-effective way. I think where government can play a strong role is ensuring that those infrastructures have what it takes in today's world to deliver these quality services in the long term. And today's world is changing. And for many of our organizations, thinking about entrusting an aging parent to a day program, or a child to a breakfast program, or your own information as a donor, today's requirements around data privacy and cybersecurity require increased levels of technological know-how and support. So we have to stop thinking about organizations through one lens, and that's cost of administration or cost of overhead or cost of fundraising. It has to be a broader approach. And I think that goes for government, and all funders and organizations need to demonstrate the value. So I think there is a role for government to support the system, create this enabling environment to allow it to thrive. And that way we'll see organizations be able to do the work that Canadians have come to expect and know in their communities.
Right. Okay. I understand what you're saying. Just to maybe dig into it a bit
Yeah.
more, and the issue about both and government and charities. I think some people would make the argument that if you have higher taxes to provide social services, that means people have less disposable income for charitable giving, and that also that there maybe is this natural kind of moving in tandem, where if you have bigger government, you have less done by civil society. If the government pulls back but provides either supports to external organizations or a taxation environment which promotes charitable giving, then you cede some of that space back to private charity. So there is, I get that they can work together, but there also is some sense in which maybe there are points of either or. Do you agree with that? Or
Sort of. I mean, to a certain degree, that
start
move into political ideology here,
yeah,
and that's fair. And the great thing about the charitable nonprofit sector, going back to the resilience comments, is that we work with both.
yeah,
And I think at times there are certain types of services that will be less appealing to funders that do require government support. And it is important that Canadians are empowered to choose where their dollars go. I actually don't think this is a binary conversation. This can be both, but I do believe that in certain aspects of our society that there will be causes who won't compete as well as others for dollars, because it's not necessarily as maybe warm and fuzzy or as attractive, or the scale of individuals affected by it is not quite as large. I think government does have a role there. And at the same time, setting the conditions so that folks have dollars to be able to make their choices around the causes they care the most about. Again, I don't see this. I don't see these in conflict.
Yeah, fair enough. Deina, what's your take on that question?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. I like to go back. What are we talking about when we talk about charity, and what does that word even mean when we're talking about charities versus government? And if you really look, if you take it back, it actually has a meaning of love. And this idea of selflessness and compassion and expressed through action. And so a charity is more than a service. This is a means for individuals and groups to meet needs, absolutely, but it's also to enrich the lives of Canadians in ways that reflects the diversity of experience, geography, needs, beliefs, and conscience that we find across our country. It's rooted in relationship, and I think charities in what they do in their activities are offering sometimes just help, but often it's much more. It's help and hope and dignity all wrapped into one. I'm not saying the government can't do that, but I think charities as expressions of individuals and groups meeting needs that they see is a much better and more effective vehicle for that. I agree with Bruce about effectiveness, efficiency, add-on innovation, of course, within the regulatory constraints that exist, and we could talk about that, I'm sure, at length. But there is innovation, as Bruce said, resilience, and the ability to work within constrained budgets, and with a volunteer base. And so charities are not one-size-fits-all programs. They are engaging in civic society in ways that government does not and cannot. The government can serve people, but charities, I would say, love people. And perhaps this is a bit idealistic, but I think this is what we want to see and what we can see and do see. And so it's transactions versus relationships. And charities, they also go beyond immediate need, as I said, and they can provide hope and help and answers to questions and issues that are just beyond the scope of government. The government can provide a space in which this can happen, and I agree with Bruce in terms of enabling, but charities really provide a unique, I think, means of maintaining a social fabric and meeting needs and expressing diversity in ways that government just is not capable of doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna probe that a little bit because let's talk about the word charity, right? It's charity is a virtue, right? And the virtue of charity or love developed in an individual, that quality of character of desiring the good for others, and you can talk about some of the pros and cons at the level of service delivery and recipient, but private charity involves the cultivation of that virtue of charity in the giver, which is not really part of the process of government programs. You have to pay your taxes, and then those are used through a program. There's no development of virtue through voluntary giving and relationship as can exist in the part of private charity. Do you agree with that, Deina? That like the development of virtue in the giver is a key purpose of private charity?
Well, I think it certainly enables that, or it creates an opportunity for that, where you can engage someone who is giving of whether it's time or finances or something expertise to a charity, and that's where that relational piece comes in, and that's where I think that whole idea of sort of enriching and strengthening a social fabric is. And I agree with Bruce. There's a role for government, and everyone I'm sure can take a different position on where you draw that line and those parameters. But I do think some of those intangibles are more likely to develop in the charitable context.
Mm-hmm. Garnet, can I jump in on this
please.
one? Yeah, it's a really fundamental question that you've raised, and and you think about what the data tells us. Right now in Canada, about 71% of contributions, individual contributions, come from less than 9% of individuals. It's hugely weighted to more affluent Canadians. And then when you bring age into it, it's interesting. Of the $12 billion given annually by Canadians, about half of that comes from people who are over the age of 60, and half of that comes from people who are over the age of 70.
Wow.
And it's interesting. So we have this concentration right now of giving in older, more affluent donors. So there will be change coming to our sector in the next 10 years, whether we want it or not, because demographics is driving it. So, but those are generations who were raised with what I would call conduits that fostered care, empathy, hope, community, neighborhood. And some of those are under distress, and some of them might be church attendance, which is going down in many places in Canada. Service clubs, where people came together with the expressed purpose of not supporting one cause, but supporting their whole community. Those are declining in attendance. I would even argue rural Canada, where when you look at data on provinces who have regularly kind of given more per capita, Manitoba is always at the top. It's by and large a rural province. So where, as a nation, are we building connectedness when we also hear that 52% of Canadians say they feel lonely once a week. So where are those conversations around the social value of caring about others taking place? Because those very places that have created individuals who are now the foundation of giving in our country, they're under some duress.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, can I just ask on the affluence piece? So, um, understand what you're saying, that obviously if you're looking at the volume of donations, more donations are going to come from affluent people because they can give more. But in terms of number of donors, do you see it showing up in the data that people who are less affluent are participating as givers, but at a lower volume, or do you have a lot of people saying, "I just can't give anything right now"?
Oh yeah, well, yes and yes. I mean, you get some folks who are just saying this is not the time.
Hmm.
Certainly, we see that younger folks who I would argue have social good almost built into who they are also at fundamentally different economic starting points than their parents and grandparents in terms of large amount of student debt if they've gone to post-secondary,
Yeah.
finding a place to live that's affordable, and this idea of lack of permanent work. It's hard to be a monthly mission-based donor when you don't know when you're going after your next contract ends. And so we see real changes in the way the underpinnings of social good are unfolding in today's day and age. And I think it really means that we need to be questioning, what does this future look like, because we've been supported in a particular way for a very long time.
Right, but to your point as well, like those same young people, they're probably also, maybe they're
Yep.
in some cases, not always, but a little bit more transient. That they don't have the same kind of uh, community connectors that people in one time had, if they were sort of part of the same sort of permanent, geographically defined community for generations.
Well, and they are finding ways. I think that's important to
Yeah.
note. They are finding ways, but it's also this tension of sometimes they're gravitating away from the word charity, even itself, away from institutional giving, more to finding ways to give directly to individuals so that they can see or witness the
Mm.
impact of their participation. So giving in all different kinds of ways is changing.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to, um, you had talked earlier, Bruce, about just some of the legal parameters around operating environments and structure. Um, in terms of the role of government, what can government do to improve the operating environment for private charity? Maybe start with Bruce and then go to you, Deina.
Yeah, so there's a few things. I mean, and I think these are what I would call micro investments for macro benefit. I mean, something that we've been advocating with the support of the sector for a long time is the idea of having a unit in government that actually understands the charitable and nonprofit sector. I would say that unfortunately, we spend a lot of time trying to roll back policy ideas or articulations that don't seem well grounded in knowledge about our sector. And so having a small cohort inside government who could contribute perspectives based on knowledge and data around our sector would be really valuable to have more holistic discussions around good public policy for the sector. So that's one. The second thing really does relate to data and ensuring that as the government through Stats Can collects data about our country, that our sector is intentionally part of that, because it relates to the third point, which is, we're a big employer in this country. 2.4 million Canadians work in charities and nonprofits, about 10% of the Canadian labor force. And so it's important that when government is making policy decisions, that it's doing so in an informed way, because it's affecting people in every community in this country. So there's just three examples of things that the federal government could do in an intentional and stated way that would make everybody's lives better.
Yeah, thank you. Good recommendations. Deina, what do you think?
Well, I think one thing that we would like to see and have been asking and pursuing for quite some time. I'll back up briefly before I get to what it is, but there are guidance documents for the various heads of charity. So, alleviating poverty, advancing education. So, there are guidance documents from the Canada Revenue Agency for charities within those purposes or objects, to understand how they are to operate within the CRA's interpretation of the law. close to 40% of Canada's 86,000 registered charities are advancing religion. And there is an advancement of religion guidance. However, it has never been formally released by the government. It has been accessed and published through access to information requests. And we know it is operationalized within the Charities Directorate and is in use on a regular basis to assess applications, to weigh information in an audit process. It's used internally. And we also know that there have been efforts to try and publish it, preparing the guidance for publication, but we have yet to see that happen. And that is a significant portion of the sector. And we think it's very important for all charities to have that type of foundational guidance, to know what rules are being applied internally when they are actually engaging in that already in advancement of religion without those parameters being published formally. So
that's very strange. Would it be accessible through the ATIP process though?
It is, yes.
Okay.
And I'll be going through that process again. Well, it has been done by other people and published online. You can easily access it. Certainly obtaining a new version is something we're doing. Access to information requests. However, that doesn't change the fact that it hasn't been formally published.
Right. Okay. So they make revisions to it, and you don't see the revisions unless and until someone files an ATIP, I suppose. That's sort of strange. I mean, it would seem like a basic accountability provision or a feature of basic systems of accountability that not just charities but other members of the public can know what criteria is being applied for how you qualify as a charitable organization and how you maintain that status. Have you gotten any explanation as to why it hasn't been published?
No. I understand that from what I have read through my own access to information requests about the guidance, that it has been prepared, but there seems to be some sort of stumbling block, and it's not clear exactly what that is. But we would certainly urge the government to move forward in publishing it as a means of transparency. And there have been questions raised. There was I did write a piece about it. There was a case where there was a concern about bias in audit selection, and one of the comments of the judge in weighing some of the evidence was that there were no standards. Well, there are standards, there are expectations and parameters, but they have not been formally published, so that organizations advancing a religion can understand if they are being treated fairly and what the expectations are. So that certainly for us is a huge priority.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. So you mentioned some other points.
Yeah. I think that another one is, it's not a specific policy per se, but maybe just a perspective shift. And I think it builds on the first matter of the guidance not being published. And it's just a shift to like empowering and encouraging, particularly faith-based charities, and viewing them as community strengthening organizations, as an essential part of that cultural fabric that I've mentioned a few times. Because I think sometimes there's a perception amongst a variety of faith groups that maybe they're seen differently because of their religious identity. And I think that there could be a bit of a perspective shift to change that. I don't have a specific policy or legislative amendment to that.
That's an interesting one, and we'll get to it in a minute because I want to ask you about the recommendations from the Finance Committee involving charities. But it does seem, and I'm sure we'll get some of this in even the comments on the podcast, that it's like if you're an organization without any kind of religious affiliation that is running a food bank, then everybody thinks that's great, and the government engages with you, as makes sense. If you're a faith-based organization that is doing exactly the same work, that is happens to be made up of people motivated from a faith perspective, but that is also just trying to feed people who are hungry, that perhaps for most people that's also great, and it's viewed positively. But there are some subset of people that are suspicious of religious motivation, even if it's towards an end that everybody agrees is a good end, and that maybe on the government side as well, there's more likely to be suspicion around religious organizations that are achieving good ends than non-religious organizations that are achieving good ends. Do you think that that's a challenge that impacts the work of Christian Charities?
Well, I'd like to think the best motivations of people, and wouldn't want to presume any ill motives on the government or anyone viewing these charities. What I was trying to just say before is that I think, based on some things that have taken place, including like the lack of publication of this guidance for more than a decade,
Yeah.
whether intentional or not, just sends a message that can be received in perhaps a wrong way. And I just think that there could be some clarity and some publication, for example, just to say,
Yeah.
you know what, your charity, this sector is valuable enough, or this subset of the sector is valuable enough to have their guidance published. It's a very simple, small ask. But
Yeah.
again, I would not want any of my comments to be taken as casting aspersions on someone's motivation. I think it's just a perception question that could
Yeah.
easily be remedied.
Yeah. Fair enough. But let's dig further into that then, and I'll stick with you, Deina. The Before Parliament was shut down, the Finance Committee tabled a series of recommendations. One of which was that, quote, asking the government to amend the Income Tax Act to provide a definition of a charity which would remove the privileged status of advancement of religion as a charitable purpose. This would obviously be quite a radical reform. As you said, it would affect 40% of charities. I do want to note that Conservatives on that committee dissented from the main report, but there was no dissenting opinion from the other three parties. So, Deina, what would be the implications of this proposal if it were to become government policy, and what was your reaction to the proposal?
Well, to be honest, I was quite shocked when I did read the recommendation. It seemed to come without any consultation, any rationale. Reading the report, it's simply the recommendation and nothing to substantiate why that recommendation had been made. Obviously, deep concern that such a recommendation would be made. You know, if there were if it were a different head of charity, it would be equally concerning. If it were to remove, alleviation of poverty as a charitable purpose, that would be deeply concerning and equally concerning, without rationale, explanation, etc. It's it's difficult to describe, I think, the change or the scope, the significance of this recommendation to the sector. I think it. I could certainly get into many details about it. I mean, it's even unclear exactly what they mean by what this recommendation means by removing privileged status. Exactly, is it intended to try to remove advancement of religion as a charity, which is actually established in common law and not the Income Tax Act? How does that exactly work in the end? I see Bruce somewhat nodding there. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say as well. But it's hugely problematic. Impacting that number of charities, sort of a kind of a bit of a disregard for the sector, our role, the work that's done, the significance of it, no consultations. It's at odds internally with another recommendation within the report, that is to invest in an anti-Islamophobia strategy. As we've expressed in a letter, you cannot on one hand suggest that you have the interests of a religious community at heart, and on the other hand strip it of its registered charitable status. Obviously there are charter issues that arise. There are so many questions, many questions, very few answers at
Yeah.
this point.
And just to put a fine point on the consequence, if this were to become government policy, it would strip charitable status um, from all faith-based organizations, or from houses of worship that don't have some other charitable purpose as well. Like you could still be a Muslim or Christian food bank, but you can't get charitable status as a house of worship. Is that, like, what would be the consequence of? And I appreciate your point that it's unclear, but just trying to understand what they may have meant with this recommendation.
Well, I mean, I do think that's up in the air at this point.
Yeah.
One doesn't know. It could be much further reaching than it is. Is it retroactive? Is it prospective? What? There are so many questions. So I think it is a bit difficult to give you a specific answer as to the potential scope and impact and what this looks like.
Okay, Bruce, what's your reaction to this? You work with
Yeah.
charities, faith based and not, so you kind of are working with the whole sector. What's your
Yeah.
reaction?
Well, maybe just to pick up on the last part of the conversation, it's also interesting the way it was worded in the sense that there's many organizations that have a multitude of services. So it also really depend on under which head, as we refer to, of charity they were registered, because it
Mhm.
spoke to one particular avenue. So I think there's more questions than answers in the recommendation. But at kind of a macro level, maybe 2 points on this. One is, our understanding of kind of the where this came from was related to a policy brief from a BC-based organization that actually proposed a couple of pathways for an interest that it had. One of the pathways was reflected in this recommendation. The other was not. And it's interesting that I think we would have to really go back and take a look at where this came from to understand what the motivation for it is. Now, that being said, I would say at a macro level, a couple of things. One, it feels incomplete in my mind that if we're going to talk about what constitutes charity, and that dual tax privilege that we talked about right off the top, that's a macro level conversation that includes all four heads of charity, not just one. And so if Canada wants to step back and have that conversation, then that's one that we should have in a holistic, thoughtful, and intentional manner, not just looking at one of them. Because as Deina said, this is right now, there's no Charities Act in Canada. This is enshrined in common law, which has been around for a long time. So there are other jurisdictions like the UK that created a Charities Act and moved things around a little bit. That's pretty big. And also, as we look at the interplay between provinces and the federal government, and where where the jurisdictions overlap, it's not as uncomplicated as it might sound. So I think it felt like both a surprise. I echo that, a bit of a surprise recommendation, one that's incomplete, and I think it also doesn't really also take into account the real to use a term like the genesis of charity as it's been in this country. I mean, it's the advancement of religion space. It's been integral to our identity as a sector, and it's this concept. It's not just the Christian faith, it's other faiths of
Yeah.
giving is really enshrined in religions. And so, this idea of having kind of a fulsome, nuanced, open-minded dialogue on the modernization of the sector's legal regime. Yeah, okay, that's great. But let's make sure that we do it in a thoughtful and intentional way.
Hmm. Um, to pick up on one thing you said, understanding where this is coming from and why. I mean, um, yeah, it's sort of out of the blue, right? At a time when so many people are struggling to say, well, let's add another challenge by sort of complicating and excluding people from the existing charities framework. Is this just a a proposal in search of a problem, or is there something that the proposers were getting at that you know of, or some broader reform they were contemplating?
Yeah, I can't really speak to that, to be
Okay.
honest with you. But I think what's fair game is that the federal government invites policy briefs from businesses and from organizations
Yeah.
across the country when the pre-budget submissions open. The fact that they looked at one and saw something, that's fair game in my mind. Does it mean that we should move directly to that solution? No, I think there needs to be a thoughtful and due process here to understand what the impact is. Because if you even look at it on the ground, to some of the points we were talking about earlier about giving, on average, people who attend a place of worship regularly donate twice as much as secular Canadians. And so there are on the ground implications for both faith-based organizations, but those who are not affiliated, but benefit from the generosity of those who are part of a community where they give broader as well. So this is we should not leap to one conclusion. We need to have a thoughtful discussion if any government wants to move this forward.
Deina, what do you have a sense of some of what the underlying motivations or objectives may be with a proposal like this? I mean, is it out of the blue, or is this part of something else?
I like Bruce. I don't have specific insight into the motivations behind including this. I do think it relates somewhat to that sort of vague issue that I was addressing before in the perception for faith-based organizations out there, that they're not understood, they're not valued. I mean, they're looking at this saying, "Wait, what?"
Yes.
my charitable status is on the chopping block, and so I think it adds to that perception for them. As to the motivations, I don't have a comment on that, but I do think it also it neglects to recognize um, how places of worship and religious institutions are actually very important to a wide variety of Canadians, including recent Canadians, new
Mhm.
Canadians, as places of integration, social cohesion, support. Um, those are very important. And I think, as Bruce mentioned, we're looking like a lot of these really practical, aside from the question of how we're going to approach charitable objects generally, like there are so many, I mean, probably countless practical implications that have not even been considered. All we have here is a conclusory statement. And I think that procedural piece, aside from the substance of the recommendation, the procedural piece is also concerning, or the lack of procedure and consultation and openness and these sorts of things that Bruce has alluded to. That is also concerning.
Yeah, and you weren't consulted on this, I suppose, then, or either of you. I
No.
mean, yeah, okay. Um, I wanted to also ask. So there's two recommendations. Really, this is number 430. It's gotten a lot of attention. 429 says, "quote No longer provide charitable status to anti-abortion organizations." And I think what sort of jumps out at me about this recommendation is um, it doesn't define um, sort of what it's talking about in terms of the organization. Like, is it a matter of the organization is directly involved in some kind of advocacy on those issues, because political advocacy work is already not a charitable purpose, but it would seem to imply a targeting of organizations that are not engaged in political advocacy on the abortion issue, but that maybe people that are running food banks or hospitals or mosques, churches, whatever it is, who maybe happen to have those convictions. Um, I guess I'm asking you guys to make sense of someone else's recommendations here, but these are important policy questions, like how would this work if it was implemented? So, uh, Deina, did you have any response, or were you able to make sense of what they were getting at here? Because it's not odd when you say remove charitable status from these organizations. It's not obvious to me at all who has charitable status right now that they'd want to take it away from. I understand there's organizations the government may not like, who are involved in advocacy work on these issues, but I don't think, generally speaking, they would have charitable status anyways.
Okay. Well, in general, on this issue, because it has manifested itself in a few different ways,
Yeah.
and in a different there and there's a related one that came out of the Senate that I can address. But this, in our view, is politicizing charitable status.
Okay.
Regardless of whether let's substitute in any other subcategory of organization. No longer provide charitable status to certain environmental organizations. No longer provide charitable status to certain faith groups. No longer provide charitable status to certain animal rights groups who speak about the sealing, SEALING, industry in a certain
Mhm.
way. So, regardless of what you want to insert in that space, this is an issue, and it's politicizing charitable status. And so we definitely take issue with that. Um, I agree with your question, or your what you said about the lack of clarity on what the scope of this could be, this particular scope. I do think that's a finer issue than the biggest issue on the table, the politicizing of charitable status that we see here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, especially if the implication is that, like, there's going to be some kind of assessment of the opinions the people that are running the organization. Because there would be certain organizations. I mean, I can think of Catholic social service organizations that are connected with a faith community that has a position on this issue, but those organizations are not involved in that issue. So it becomes like a political assessment of the opinions of the people running an organization, disconnected from what the organization is actually. It's very, very, very strange. Maybe Bruce, what's your reaction to this whole issue of the recommendation, and then also to Deina's comments about politicization of status determinations?
Yeah, it's a very similar stance. What folks might not realize is that by law, charities are required to be nonpartisan.
Mm-hmm.
And so being brought into political ideological debates is a problem for our sector. So Imagine Canada is on record as saying that we do not support any government, regardless of political stripe, who leverages either the Income Tax Act or the Canada Revenue Agency to target charitable organizations who work with groups where they may not agree. We think this is offside. Go have a political conversation elsewhere, because by law, actually, if a particular party was governing and took a position, we're not actually allowed to say we disagree with that,
Right.
unless we go through all these other hoops. It's a problematic space for us. Let's make charitable and nonprofit work about community and not politics. And so it's important that our sector is not included in broad-ranging statements that relate to particular political viewpoints. Regardless of what you view on abortion, regardless of the seal hunt, regardless of environmental community, you'll have your political views. That's fine. Access that work through the channels of government and through the channels of democracy. And in the charitable space, organizations can continue to do their work.
Yeah. And do you think the charitable sector would be pretty united in that view?
Well, that's a great question. As far as we can tell, the conversations we've had with organizations, yes.
Yeah.
And there may be some. I mean, it's a huge sector,
Right.
so there's not always consensus or unanimity. But I would say, by and large, it's a difficult place to put charities in, to be talking about partisan political viewpoints, regardless of what they are, regardless of which government, when we're not supposed to be doing that.
Yeah, and I would imagine that there would be a general concern about, in terms of politicization of charitable status, it may be one of those things that, that once you open the door, that there ends up being a whole bunch of other things that come through that door of politicization. Like, okay, do we really want people who think this, or do we really want people who think that getting charitable status? And then all of a sudden it becomes a tool used to used in a very kind of ideological way to shape thinking about issues, rather than as a more kind of open, accessible vehicle on objective criteria.
Yeah, I would say that by and large, most charities in this country, vast majority, bring people together on causes they care about in their communities. We don't want the charitable and nonprofit place to be a space that might be divisive, and nor for regardless of your mission and cause, at the heart of your offering in your communities is trust. And if folks are saying, well, why are organizations now spending money on partisan political campaigns? That's a problem for our sector. And it's not a place that our sector should be in. It really is about how are we, as community members, regardless of our political ideologies, we're sitting shoulder to shoulder, packing boxes in food banks, or helping folks with mental health issues, or supporting children and youth programs. That's what we should be doing, not getting engaged in those kinds of partisan issues.
Yeah. So Deina, back to you. I mean, I think the point is important. Generally, we think of charity, we think of things that bring communities together. Of course, there would be many registered charities of different kinds that would be doing activities that someone somewhere would disagree with, right? I mean, religious charities, not everyone's on board with that. Some people see religion, or particular religions, as being harmful to society, right? There are going to be other kinds of charitable activities, you know, it could be people nominally doing education on certain issues, but are seen as having one kind of bent or another. Um, so it is a reality in the charitable world, isn't it, that there are going to be people who disagree with what charities do, and therefore critique the kind of tax benefit structure. Um, where does that threshold have to be for maybe not everybody agrees, but enough people agree that this is a good purpose that has positive effects for society?
Yeah, well, thankfully, we don't vote on what charity should get registered charitable status. It's not that way. It's not how our system is set up. What the charitable sector does do is it reflects the diversity of our country and our communities. And as Bruce said, while of course it's not going to be unanimous in terms of if the whole charitable sector sat down and said, well, um, we all agree on A, B, or C, or this particular issue. That's not going to happen. But I think there is a large consensus on the issues of principle that charitable status shouldn't be subject to a political or ideological opinion. That's the beauty of our charitable sector, is that it reflects what we look like, and that is going to cause some difference. But I think actually the sector has done quite well with living in that space where we don't agree on everything, but we understand each other. We understand that we all are on a charitable mission. We all have charitable objectives and are serving the public in different ways to meet different needs that really do exist. Um, and it, and so I think it's a great example of diversity within a particular form of charity. And so I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think we can look to the sector to say, okay, this is working quite well overall. Not perfect. There are always ways to improve it. Like, don't get me wrong. But I think if we look at other sectors, maybe the charitable sector has is a good example of getting along with differences of opinion.
Yeah, I suppose the other point is that if not everyone agrees with what every charity is doing, I think most people should be able to see that having a diverse charitable sector that is free, that is able to do its work without political interference, in aggregate, it makes all of us better off. And fiddling with the structure that sustains so much of our community health puts our collective well-being at risk. This has been a great conversation. I want to give just as we wrap up, give the opportunity back to you to close on anything we've missed. I mean, you've both been really generous with your time today. I mean, we've talked about kind of what charities are, what the structure that they operate under is. We've talked about kind of their interface with government, the kind of legal social operating environment, and then also the way that these latest recommendations from the finance committee do raise sort of questions and concerns about politicization. What are just final word from both of you in terms of the kinds of takeaways you want people to have from this conversation? What you want people to know about the charitable sector and understand about what that interface with government should ideally look like? So, Bruce, do you want to start the conclusions off, and then I'll give Deina the last word?
Well, I do speeches on this, so I'll try
Okay.
and be brief.
Yeah.
It's well. First of all, again, thanks for the opportunity. It's a great invitation. I would think by and large, the takeaway that I hope folks will take is that there is a place for government to help unleash the power of social good, whether that is through funding instruments, whether it's through regulation or the law. It's a way of structuring a system whereby citizens can engage with each other to make their communities better. And I think it's funny when you come in contact with Imagine Canada, you'll see a lot of triangles because they actually represent the coming together of the three sectors, the private sector, the government sector, and the charitable and nonprofit sector. Because we believe that the kind of societies that we have enjoyed and hope to continue to enjoy at a community level are benefit because of the interplay between those three. It's too big a job for anyone to do on their own, but when we come together, we can actually solve these. And so continued conversation, thoughtful, data-based, evidence-based conversation about the development of good policy will help those organizations on the ground in communities thrive. And so I hope that these are the kinds of conversations that we'll be having in a continued way going forward.
Great. And Deina, last word to you.
Well, like Bruce, I do want to echo my thanks for inviting me to participate in this conversation. It's been great. Really appreciate hearing from both of you and contributing from a charitable sector perspective, but also a faith-based perspective. And so I think that's where I come at it, and just encouraging the view of charities as representative of Canadians, understanding how the charitable sector actually is a really good example of how we can work together from very diverse perspectives, but with a unified goal of serving the public. We don't all have to come at it the same way. We don't all have to do it the same way. We don't all have to believe the same things, but we can absolutely partner together and accomplish goals that are necessary. I think that's the other piece. The charitable sector is necessary. It's not an add-on. Like, this is an absolutely essential part of our social fabric. And so anything that we can do to share those stories of hope, of success, of joy that we can see within the sector, and to equip the sector, whether that means reducing administrative burdens, whether that means creating a neutral space in which all of the charities can operate, to aim for the longevity and health of the sector, because I think the health of our nation and our communities is absolutely dependent on the health of our charitable sector.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you both for being here and for the work you do. For our listeners, we publish new episodes of the Resuming Debate podcast about every 2 weeks. So if you're encountering us for the first time through this episode, please subscribe. You can follow my YouTube channel where you get this and other content. You can also subscribe anywhere you get your podcast. Leave us a review. We'll have more information in the show description, including a link to a petition we've put together specifically on this issue of the politicization of charitable status. So watch for that. Sign that petition if you like, and leave us a 5-star review. Thank you again to our guests. We'll be back with another episode in 14 days.